Pragya? Pragya?
Yes,
Yeah, we
sir.
will start the, yes, we will start it now. Yeah.
Good afternoon to all your present. Welcome to online lecture series brought to you by Interpretative. The purpose of this online lecture series is to address the young minds of scholars, academicians, and mostly TV students to bring about an awareness of the recent and ongoing studies in the sphere of academics. Have among us Dr. Irfanullah Farooqi, who is currently working as an assistant professor in the Department of Sociology, South Asian University, New Delhi. He has done his MPhil in an interpretative study with the of Faiz Ahmed's poetry, and he has done his PhD in Universalism to Muslim Nationalism and evolution of sociology, the evolution of Muhammad Iqbal's thought from Delhi. Uh, his research interest lies in the meeting point of sociology, literature, and history. He has been earlier with us delivering an erudite talk on Dante's Hymn Swaraj. It's an immense pleasure to have you again, sir. So, without any further delay, I welcome you, sir. I would like to take this opportunity to wish a very happy Teachers' Day to Dr. Irfanullah Farooqi sir, and everyone who is making sure that education reaches everyone, even in these hard times. The audience is requested to keep their microphones off and not to share their screen during the lecture. During the lecture, one can drop their questions or observations in the chat box, which I shall read chronologically post lecture. Thank you. Over to you, sir.
Okay, am I audible? Yeah?
Yes, sir.
Okay, great. Thank you, Ankita, for a very generous introduction. Thank you, Vivek, for giving me this opportunity. Not so long ago, I spent wonderful 2 hours with you all. I'm indeed grateful to Intersections, to each one of you for being here. I'm sure there are worthier things, or at least as worthy an activity as this is on a Saturday afternoon. But you've spared time, and for that I remain infinitely grateful. So for today, we plan to discuss Tagore, particularly from the vantage point of his ideas on freedom, on education, and religiosity. It's a slightly ambitious task. There's no denying that. But what I intend to do is just share with you glimpses, as it were, here and there. And the idea is that at some point in time, we might want to go through the original works of this extraordinarily remarkable thinker, philosopher, luminary. Because, of course, no matter how hard I try, I will fail, and I'll fail miserably in sort of presenting a holistic picture of either Tagore's thoughts on freedom or religiosity or education, because the man has written extensively and very, very meaningful stuff. Before I begin what I have to share, I must admit, I must confess that I don't happen to be a Tagore expert, not at all. I have been a student of, literature and history and sociology. And in the course of my studentship, that still continues. I've read here and there stuff by Tagore, and I found him extraordinarily illuminating, no matter what he reflects on. So there is a strong likelihood that some of you have read much more than what I have. And so I present my views with you all in all humility. One thing that needs to be flagged right at the outset is that I don't happen to be a Tagore expert. I'm just sharing some of the things that I think are extraordinary, and in the hope that the discussion will further enrich my understanding of these ideas or these avenues of thought. Secondly, what I also want to point out is that, this is not something that I must flag, but I'll nonetheless do this. That you see, Tagore is primarily a poet, and which is why when he writes in a slightly different way. So when you read his essays, for instance, if you read Spirit of Freedom, or if you read Poet's Religion, or if you read My School, or any other essay, for the most part, there's a there's something very poetic about Tagore's prose. So very often while reading his essays, we might get this feeling, and I think there's something very legitimate about this feeling springing deep within us, that these are not realistic ideas. That the man is essentially romanticizing. The man is not really being real. He's kind of there's an element of fantasy, so to speak, etc., etc. But my position is that as students, as teachers, as learners, I think there is a certain incentive in romanticizing things once in a while. I think we should not altogether dissociate ourselves from that domain. And what is also important is that, I mean, I have a certain bias when it comes to Tagore, so I must also flag this, that I am a biased reader. I love him for his prose, for his thought, for his imagination. So I do get carried away when I read him, when I'm speaking on him. So I would request you to, check me in my tracks, as it were. Uh, I'll start with I'll start on an autobiographical note. I'll just take 2 to 3 minutes just to situate how did Tagore enter my life. So I suppose it was maybe in class fourth or class fifth. I don't exactly remember, but definitely either fourth or fifth. That we read a story, Kabuliwala. So this was the first instance. Of course, I mean, Jangan Man, the national anthem, we used to sing during the morning assembly, but of course we did not associate Jangan Man with Tagore. We were too young to be concerned about the author of the national anthem. But definitely in class fourth, when we were reading this story, and there was something very peculiar about the ways in which stories were being read in schools back then. This is late 80s, if I remember correct, not early 90s actually. So the teacher would ask one of us, usually the monitor, to read the story. So the monitor would stand up and just read the text. He would hold the book in his hand or her hand and read the text line by line, right? And we were supposed to place our finger on the text and just follow, right? And the teacher would be roaming in the class with a ruler in her hand. So you can imagine what a disgusting environment it was for any student to be engaging with a refreshing story. And most of the stories were always read like that. But when Kabuliwala was read, I distinctly remember that it touched me. I mean, of course, it wasn't a very profound uh, moment, but it was definitely an unusual moment. And one thing that I categorically remember is that as soon as the story was over, I desperately wanted to narrate the story to someone, right? Because I had kind of, it was an immersive experience in a certain sense. And I rushed back home, and of course my mother was there, a housewife, and she was busy with her household chores, and she had to attend to my younger brother, who must have been 2 or 3 years old back then. But I kept insisting, and she had so many other things to do, but regardless of any of that, I kept insisting that you have to sit with me and I'll read out an entire story and you must listen to the story because this is such a fascinating story. And this happened for the first time. And then eventually, of course, she had to give in. So she sat down and then she asked me. So I told her Kabuliwala by this person, Tagore. And she said, well, guess what? We also read the story. It's a wonderful story. So she also remembered the story. And that immediately led to something because I never had that kind of bonding with my mother. So that was another interesting moment. So Tagore entered, and of course, in the evening when my father was back from university, I narrated the entire story to him, and he too had read the story earlier. So there was something that happened as a result of Kabuliwala, and I'm sure you have read the story. It's an extraordinary piece of writing that touches people across the age spectrum. But of course, so then later on, you read a poem by Tagore where the mind is without fear and the head is held high. Of course, most of us have read this poem, but it was read just as another poem that you had to read and you had to, prepare questions so that you could score marks, etc., etc. But much later in university, we read his essays on nationalism. And then later on, while we were doing courses on education, on religion, we read his essays on various other themes. So we read My School, we read Poet's Religion, we read Religion of the Forest, etc., etc. And one thing that we realized, and this is where I'll end the autobiographical bit, one thing that I definitely realized when reading Tagore was that here is a man who writes in a way that does not really demand much from the reader. So you read the text and you understand the text. And this is such a liberating thing in itself, because usually what happens, and I should not say this to literature students, because you are aware of dense, very, very demanding texts. So for instance, when you read high-end stuff on literary criticism, when you read culture studies, when you read postmodernism, when you read stuff into structuralism, you know very well how much, the kind of demand that the text has. If you're reading people like Homi Bhabha, if you're reading people like Deleuze, etc., you know that the prose is not just another piece of writing. Even if you know English language inside out, you will not be able to understand text in the first go. You have to go back to the text again and again. That doesn't happen with Tagore. And that was something that I found liberating. So ever since then, I've been reading stuff off and on. Now to come back to the theme, freedom, religiosity, and education. That's the sequence. But what I want to do is I want to discuss the bits on freedom first, and then move on to education, and then talk about religiosity. So I will not stick to the sequence that's there in the theme that was circulated, but I just want to tweak things a little and start with freedom, of course, move on to education, and then towards the end, try and see how does religiosity enter into this conversation that's there between freedom and education. One thing that, before I get into this whole freedom, Tagore's take on freedom, what is perhaps important to be mindful of is that Tagore is someone who is always in praise of things that are in the making. So Tagore is not really in favor of definitive, certainty. Tagore is not in favor of definite answers. Tagore is someone who is always an ardent admirer, a follower of the process, of journey. So he is someone who is always praising things that are constantly in the making, rather than things that have acquired a certain finality. So in that regard, just to keep that in mind. For instance, I'm actually reminded of an absolutely profound line by Tagore, wherein he says, "Not here, elsewhere." It's a beautiful line, "Not here, elsewhere." Very Upanishadic in terms of its fundamental philosophy. So just to keep that in mind, and then so that we can perhaps engage with freedom, religiosity, and education better. Now, if I have to discuss the bit on freedom, as you know, a text that was circulated, Spirit of Freedom. Tagore wrote this piece when the Indian national struggle was acquiring a certain definite, shall I say, temperament, mood, a definite shape. And this was the time when people were making a case for representation, right? So the Indian National Congress was making a case for Swaraj, right? Political independence, etc. Now, Tagore, and I don't want to talk about each and every argument that's there because that will take too much of time, and I don't want to miss out on other important arguments that are there in my school in Poets' Religion. But just to flag two or three important concerns. One thing that Tagore is particularly attentive to is that freedom, the fundamental question is how do we understand freedom? And I think this question remains very, very central to Tagore's philosophy in general. How do we understand freedom? And Tagore wants his readers to be aware of the fact that there is an existing political milieu, as a result of which our understanding of freedom might get affected. Right? So, for instance, if you're living in a colony, and if you're living at a time when people are spearheading an extraordinary decolonization movement, or let's say there's an organization, there's a party that is making a case for independence, political independence, representation, etc., it is but obvious that our understanding of freedom will get affected by that larger discourse within which we are situated. So Tagore wants to check that misunderstanding, or let's say that failing on our part. So one thing that he very categorically points out in this particular essay is that freedom is not something that could be transferred. So, for instance, if Indians believe that we were all free and the British came and took our freedom, now it's our responsibility to take that freedom back from them. So Tagore is essentially telling us, not literally, but he's suggesting that freedom is not necessarily something that could be transferred. So it is not something that the British have kept in their pockets, and we are going to take this thing out of their pockets and keep it in our pockets. This is not how it works. So as you could point out, that freedom is not something that is of external circumstances. It is not something that can be attained that easily. What he points out is that freedom is something that needs to be realized deep within. So it's a very important shift that Tagore tries to bring in. And so it's a profound argument in a certain sense. I think it's in the face of the dominant political discourse at that point of time. What is he pointing out? He's saying that freedom is not something to be attained. Freedom is something that is to be realized. It's an inner idea. So we need to realize the fact that we are free. Now, if you remember, when we were discussing Gandhi's Hind Swaraj, passingly I had referred, I mean, this was several weeks ago, but passingly I had referred that Gandhi was also kind of hinting at this, that if yourself is not free, then no matter, I mean, it doesn't matter whether the British are there or not, because if you are not able to control your own self, then whether you are an inhabitant of the colony or you are an inhabitant of a country that colonizes, it doesn't really matter. Right? So Gandhi was very clear. Now, Gandhi is writing this in 1909. Tagore is writing this a little before. So I don't know whether Gandhi had read Tagore's Spirit of Freedom as he wrote the Hind Swaraj or not, but there is a certain overlap that cannot be missed, that cannot be overlooked. So Tagore is saying that freedom is not something that is to be understood as an exteriority or as a matter of external circumstances, but something that needs to be realized deep within. So in that regard, Tagore is essentially making the case of freedom of mind and spirit, right? And not necessarily freedom that is understood from the vantage point of the political. Now, I just want to not necessarily digress, but seek recourse to another fantastic essay, Nationalism in India, which was written in 1917. I don't want to go into the details of that, but I just want to draw your attention to the opening line of the essay. So in the opening line, if memory serves me right, Tagore writes that our problem is social. Or maybe he writes, our problem is not political, but social. This is the opening of nationalism in India in 1917. Now, if you think about the connections, then what Tagore is pointing out in nationalism in India is something that he has actually pointed out in Spirit of Freedom. So when Tagore says that problem is not political, problem is social, what does that mean? What Tagore is pointing out is that even if you are able to shoo the British away, even if you are able to kick them out of the subcontinent, there are so many things that remain in India. There are so many things that plague us as a society, and we will not be able to do anything about that. So fundamentally, we should be more geared towards what is within. So Tagore is someone who is actually, for the most part, geared towards drawing our attention to the inside, the inner domain, because it's the inner domain that is essentially the source of, in a certain sense, awakening, enlightenment, or a certain kind of higher consciousness. Similarly, so he says our problem is not political, social, but social, right? So the idea is that first we need to figure out what the hell is going on inside our society. Look into that, the caste practice, all kinds of other prejudices on the basis of gender, on the basis of race, on the basis of identity, etc., etc. So once all of this is sorted out, the political problem might not matter, or it might not remain as significant as we thought it would. It is. If I were to draw another connection, just take 1 minute. Ambedkar, if you remember in Annihilation of Caste, Ambedkar categorically, there are two sections in Annihilation of Caste that talk about, so one section says, why social reform is necessary for political reform. Then there is another section I don't exactly remember the chronology, but I believe first he talks about why social reform is necessary for political reform, and then he writes why social reform is necessary for economic reform. Ambedkar is also, although more forcefully and in a very different style of writing, Ambedkar is also making this case that political reform is secondary. This whole idea that we need to kick the British out, we need to become independent, this is secondary. In fact, for Ambedkar, it was not even secondary. Fundamentally, primarily, what is important is that we must reform ourselves. We must get into what is within the society. So that is one. Now, coming back to Spirit of Freedom, Tagore is essentially saying that we seem to have mistaken the idea of freedom, which is why the idea of freedom has become, to borrow from the ineffectual, right? So it's a currency, it's a word that has a certain currency. A lot of people are talking about freedom, freedom, freedom. Definitely in India, a lot of people are talking about it, and there's a certain energy that is associated with the idea. But Tagore is of the opinion that we haven't got the gist, we haven't got the spirit right. Because freedom fundamentally is something that is of the inner, that's to do with the inner domain. So we need to realize that. The other thing that is very important with respect to freedom, as Tagore points out, is that fundamentally speaking, any individual who is free will always promote freedom all around. And this is where there could be a connection between his take on freedom and his writings on education in general. What he's pointing out is that if I am free, so if I claim, let's say I'm a teacher, and I claim to be a free individual, I genuinely believe that I'm free. And if I'm not promoting a culture of freedom in the classroom, then I am not true to the claim that I'm making, right? Or I'm not free, right? Period. There's no possibility of any other extension to this. So anyone who is free is supposed to create freedom or promote freedom or extend freedom all around. And this is something that Tagore is very particular about. That so if we are free in terms of, so if our mind and spirit are free, then in terms of spirit and mind, if we are free, then it is obvious that we will create freedom all around, right? So it is impossible that we are free and we don't create freedom all around. Tagore is also drawing our attention to the British and the Indians. So, for instance, for the most part, people were of the opinion that the British are free and the Indians are not free. So, political discourse was of this time that you guys are free, why have you taken freedom from us? Tagore is essentially questioning that position. Tagore is saying, if we were to extend the argument that Tagore makes in Spirit of Freedom, that the British are actually not free either. Because had the British been free, then they would have extended freedom all around. But the fact that they are colonizing as much as they can implies that they are the most enslaved of all the races. They are the most enslaved of all the people. They are the most enslaved of all the nations of the world. And he does talk about it, that the one who slaves, as you get more slaves, you get more enslaved. As you erect more and more walls, you only get more and more isolated. So he says that the king essentially is the most unfree or the most enslaved of all the people. But commonsensically speaking, we think that king is the freest of all the individuals. So the fact of the matter is that the king, according to Tagore, is not necessarily free because he's constantly burdened by this anxiety because there's so much bondage that's all around. There's so much enslavement that's all around that you cannot understand, that you cannot entertain this idea, according to Tagore, that the king is free. So this is, in a certain sense, of course, there are other arguments as well. But Tagore fundamentally is pointing out that freedom is an inner idea. It needs to be realized. It is not a transferable thing that I am free. Then you take my freedom, I take my freedom back, and I become free again. This is not how it is to be understood. And only those who are free are morally capable of allowing freedom to others. So we can extend this to parents and children as well. If we are free as parents, then we should be able to allow our children to exercise as much freedom as they can, right? To sort of indulge in reckless curiosity, to make use of what Tagore calls the sense of wonder, etc., right? So this is something that's there in Spirit of Freedom. So just to, I'm of course, as I said in the beginning, that I won't be able to attend to each and every argument, but I suppose these are core arguments that are there in Spirit of Freedom. But what is it that comes out of this particular essay then, as we go into Tagore's ideas on education? What fundamentally is important is that how is Tagore trying to reconceptualize the idea of freedom? And what he is essentially trying to then tell us is that if you think about any creative exercise, right, any creative endeavor, any creative activity, whether it's about painting or sculpting or dancing or theater, whatever, name it, any creative exercise is fundamentally premised on an idea of fearlessness and freedom. So if you're not free, then you will not be able to create anything. Because creation or creativity is fundamentally linked with, in fact, freedom is indispensable in relation to creativity. You cannot be creative. And even if, so say for instance, which is why very often when there is censorship, when there is state-sponsored suppression, artists would always stage a protest. There are demonstrations, there are protests, there are rallies, and artists, writers, thinkers, philosophers, they write. And why do they write? Because they say that in this kind of an atmosphere, when there is so much fear, we will not be able to exercise our creativity. We will not be able to engage. We will not be able to invest in our creative pursuits as much as we would like to. So Tagore is essentially saying that any creative endeavor, any creative exercise, any creative activity is fundamentally informed by freedom. and of course fearlessness. So fearlessness is very important. So if we go back to the poem that we read in class 9 to 10, if I remember correctly, where the mind is without fear. So a fearless mind is a fundamental prerequisite for any creative exercise. A fearless mind, a free mind. So this is something that I think comes out of spirit of freedom. Now, once this is sorted out, then we move on to his take on education, which is again on the basis of a specific essay that was circulated, My School. Now, if you've read the piece, you know I don't have to tell this to you. You know it for a fact that it's a spectacular piece of writing. There's something remarkably magical about the ways in which Tagore is drawing our attention to the fundamentals of education and the importance of nurturing creativity in children, right, as far as their early years are concerned. So Tagore then, in the context of My School, and just to again, connect a few things from Spirit of Freedom to My School, Tagore is again and again talking about how, for any creative exercise to take place, for any creative activity to take place, what is really important is that we must have an atmosphere of wholeness, complete atmosphere, as it were. And what he is essentially pointing out is that children, children require this wholeness. So, for instance, what schools do, of course, there are many other arguments as well, but I'll again hold my horses and resist the temptation. I'll just take two, three, four important arguments that could perhaps be considered as significant for the discussion at the moment. What Tagore points out is that school deprives the child of the completeness of the world, right? Now, the child, as you know, as we all know, the child is essentially a repository of curiosity, right? A child is always wondering. A child is always curious about a lot of things. I mean, of course, if it's a child and you've taught everything, then of course it looks like a child, but not a child anymore, as much of an adult as any of us are. But a child, in true sense of the term, is full of curiosity. So, for instance, if you ever take a stroll, if you are on a stroll with a child, walking with a child, and if the child is actually a child, then the child is going to ask so many questions. The child is always asking questions, and remarkably exciting questions, like genuine, fresh set of inquiries all the time. And very often, a child also asks the questions about the same thing again and again and again. Now, Tagore, what he is hinting at, perhaps, he does not directly articulate this in the piece, but what he is perhaps hinting at is that every time a child inquires, what is our responsibility? What do we do? So let's say, I'll give you an example. Let's say a child is in the balcony or a child is in the park, and child is, let's say, 2 years old or 2.5 years old or 3 years old, and the child is just running around, and you are there. And suddenly there's a butterfly. Right? Now, the butterfly is, of course, another, it's a wonder. It's a wonder of the world for a child, and particularly for a child who sees the butterfly for the first time. The child is completely enthralled by this strange creature. And of course, because you are next to him or her, mother, father, elder brother, etc., the first question that the child has is, what is it? Right? This is as obvious, as natural as anything. It's almost like instinctual. What is it? What is it? Because I haven't seen this earlier. Now, this is where Tagore is expecting us to not answer. Because the moment you say it's a butterfly, that's the end of child's curiosity. Right? A child must arrive at this understanding that this is a butterfly. A child should not be fed things so instantly. And as a result, so for instance, what I would then, if you were to extend this, very often as parents, I mean, of course, I'm not addressing students here, but parents, very often we take pride in the fact that our kids know the names of all the animals, our kids know the names of all the trees, our kids know all the names of plants, etc. But according to Tagore, that's like killing the child's curiosity, because you're not supposed to instantly provide them what they want, because a child has his or her own way of arriving at things. So, for instance, if for a moment you were to also become a child and simply say that I have absolutely no idea what this is, I'm also seeing this for the first time. Now, this is when the child engages with the butterfly in a completely different way, because the child does not operate in a world of beautiful and ugly. For a child, the entire world is sacred. The entire world is beautiful. So the dust is as beautiful as the flower. But we as parents, because we are trained in, as Tagore says, we are raised in a peculiar world of habits. We would want the child to stay away from dust, but he has such a deep love for dust, right? And he also has, or she also has a love um, for the flower, for leaves, for anything that's around. So for the child, the entire world is sacred, right? The child does not make this distinction. Now, of course, this is not to say that the child should not be kept away from things that could harm him or her, but Tagore is essentially talking about the wholeness of the world. And what the schools essentially do is they deprive the child of that wholeness, right? The schools, what they do is, Tagore uses a very interesting phrase, symmetrical conveniences, right? So what they do is they cut his or her life into symmetrical conveniences. So this period you will do this, that period you will do that, and then following that you will do this. But for the child, life is essentially a whole. For a child, everything is constantly flowing into one another, and this is the way in which a child learns. Now, Tagore gives a wonderful example. And I'm sure you remember this example very well from the text. Tagore says that one successful, uses this word categorically, successful disciplinarian headmaster, he once saw a child who climbed up a tree and found a comfortable fork branch, and he sat there and was doing his studies. Now the headmaster was quite disturbed by this. The headmaster couldn't make sense of this because ideally a child should essentially sit on a chair, find a table, and place his book or her book there, and then sit and focus and read. But here is a child who is essentially climbing up a tree and finding a comfortable, fork branch and just, seated comfortably and reading, studying. Now he complains. And what is very important about this development is that Tagore is essentially pointing out that once again, the wholeness of it is something that the headmaster is completely missing out on. So, for instance, if you think about botany lessons, as Tagore points out in the essay, how do we teach botany? Right? How do we teach our students, say, parts of a tree? How do we teach a tree? Now, one thing that we could do is, and this is something that happens all the time, we have been raised on this diet of instruction. One thing that we could do is, we do all the time, is you get a larger than life chart, and a beautiful chart, fairly illustrious in a certain sense, and very colorful, and there are lines. There are parts that are identified, and there are words. So, for instance, stem, root, branches, flowers, leaves, etc., etc. And you hold a stick in your hand, and the children are sitting in the classroom, and you teach the children that this is what the trunk is, this is what the stem is, this is what the roots and branches, etc., etc. And the children also learn, of course, right? Because this is the way in which we are teaching them. And they come back and they tell us that today we learned about the tree, and we feel proud as parents that, oh, wonderful, you know the branch, you know the branches, you know the flowers, you know the trees, but you know the leaves, etc. But Tagore says that this is essentially, it's like there's something merciless about this kind of instruction. Tagore is essentially pointing out that this is not how it is supposed to be. How it is supposed to be. For instance, he says that we are essentially depriving the child, his education through touch. So, for instance, if a child were to be taken to a tree, right? Let's say the first encounter is with the tree itself. Now there is a tree, the child touches the tree, and the child essentially embraces the tree, plays with the tree, and is completely left spellbound by the sheer magnanimity of the tree, its grandeur, its green, the imposing character of its green, etc. Now, when you ask the child about the tree now this is a completely different mode of educating. And the child has actually, in a certain sense, arrived at the tree. The child has not learned about the tree. He has or she has arrived at the tree, and now his or her understanding of the tree is going to be very, very different as compared to a conventional school-trained child, right? Who has seen the chart paper and who has also, and this is something that parents do all the time. Thankfully, I have been relieved of that because my daughter doesn't go to any school. But very often we've seen that parents, they are cutting various parts of the tree and they are pasting. So there is a book, a scrapbook or an art book, and the children don't do this. Of course, it's the parents who do this. So you cut the tree, you cut the branches, you cut the flowers, or you also get leaves and flowers from a nursery. So you get a proper flower and you paste it, and that becomes. So you point out these are petals, these are this, these are that, etc., etc. But Tagore is saying that this is such a disconnected way of teaching. So you're teaching the tree, but you haven't really, in a certain sense, informed the child. You haven't educated the child in true sense of the term because the wholeness part is missing. Now, what Tagore points out, and I think this is very crucial, he says that the tree should not become just a fact. I think it's a very profound argument. So, what the poet philosopher is pointing out is that, end of the day, children should not understand tree as simply a fact. What does he mean by that? The trees are responsible for giving us oxygen. Trees take carbon dioxide. Trees have chlorophyll. Trees do this, photosynthesis. All these are facts. Of course, there's no denying that these facts are important. Of course, trees are important for what they do. But the fact of the matter is that there is something more than the facts that we teach. So so Tagore says that we are taught in a way as if we are living in a world without trees. Right? So ideally, we should be taught in a way that we are able to engage with trees as naturally as we can. So, for instance, being able to climb a tree. Now, Tagore says this is part of educating the feet. That your feet should not be deprived of their education. What is the education of the feet? The education of the feet is that people should be able to walk barefoot, and they should know how to place their foot as they are walking. Now, we will not be able to do this because, to borrow from Tagore, we carry a thick soul of ignorance beneath our feet. So we are always with footwear. So we don't know how to walk barefoot. But children, they not only walk barefoot, they also know where to place how much weight. Right? So even if they're treading on a path where you have thorns, thorns might not prick their feet as much as they will ours, because we are not educated at all. We are hopelessly ignorant when it comes to the education of the feet. Our feet are ignorant. And Tagore says that this is so unfortunate that we have been given the feet, and the idea is that you develop an intimate association with the earth, because the earth is essentially how do you connect with Mother Earth? Of course, the most immediate thing is you walk on Earth. And how do you walk on Earth? If you're wearing Nike or Adidas or Reebok or I don't know, Bata for that matter, of course the education remains neglected. So Tagore he's very clear. He's not at all making a case that we should neglect footwear altogether. He's not saying that we should all become ascetics and we should only walk barefoot. But what he's pointing out is that there is a time in life when children should not be deprived of this education. Of course, they will wear footwear. Of course, they will go for brands. I mean, depends on where life takes them. But these early years of educating the feet will actually go a long way in informing them or informing their lives as sentient, sensible human beings. Right. So he is not at all saying that we should be completely, we should do away with all of this footwear, etc. But he is essentially saying that we should be sensitive to the needs. So what he is essentially pointing out in this piece is that education is not something that is only to be associated with the mental. So education is as much about the physical as it is about the mental, as it is about the spiritual. So it's again the wholeness. So what the modern education was doing was that it was only attending to the intellectual, the mental, the cognitive, and it was completely doing away with the physical, the spiritual, the psychic. Not necessarily psychic. That's Aurobindo in a different context, but definitely the spiritual and the physical. This is something that Tagore has serious issues with, because for him, education is not something that can be only restricted to the mental. Of course, that's one part of education, but we know, and I've already explained very briefly, that what happens when you're only mentally educated, when your body is completely deprived of its education. So, for instance, when your hands are deprived of the education that we acquire through touch, right? When your feet are deprived of the education, when your olfactory senses are deprived of their education, when your eyes are deprived of their education, etc., etc. So the entire human body is to be educated through various ways. And if we just leave children on their own, or if we allow freedom to them, they actually educate themselves way better than any of us can. So the idea is that let them sort of exercise their freedom. And as they exercise their freedom, what happens is that they acquire this education that will go a long way. So what Tagore is pointing out, and I think it's a very profound statement. It has remained with me ever since I read this piece for the first time, I think in 2006. That's when I read it for the first time. But this one line has remained with me ever since. Tagore says, we have come to this world not to merely know it, but to accept it, right? Because knowledge is something that is not going to take us. Of course, knowledge is very important. There's something exceptionally virtuous about acquiring knowledge. But there is a way in which we must also understand the harmony part of the world, the oneness of the world, a certain sympathy with the interconnectedness that exists in between various manifestations of existence. So Tagore says we need to accept it. And he says we acquire fullness by sympathy, right? We acquire power by knowledge, of course. Knowledge acquires provides a certain edge. But fullness, this completeness, that is something that can only be acquired through what he says sympathy or through acceptance of the way things are. So this is something that's there. To end particularly this particular reflection on education, there's a way in which what he's essentially pointing out is that uh, education should not be in a certain sense compartmentalized, because compartmentalization is something that is only going to go against the interests of education, particularly when it comes to children. So it is something that there has to be a direct communication and there has to be a wholeness to it, right? So in completion, in schools, as he rightly points out, that they completely deny the wholeness. The curriculum denies the wholeness. This rigid timetable stuff denies the wholeness. He says life must be in harmony. So when we are living, we should be living in harmony with everything around that is living, everything around that informs our existence. So this is something that's there in relation to my school. Lastly, uh, it is, and why does he insist on this? Because this piece essentially came into being because he had established a school on his own. So Sri Niketan was established, and then subsequently, or a little later, Shanti Niketan, Grand University as we know it, was established. And because Tagore didn't have any experience of going to school. I mean, Tagore went to school, as you might have, after reading this piece, you might know that Tagore went to school, but because he was so sensitive, he realized that something very fundamental in him was getting mercilessly mutilated. Right, his inner creativity was getting suppressed, and he was not able to freely, as it were, acquire knowledge or freely engage with the world. And as a result, what happened was, of course, Tagore was a privileged kid. He comes from of a highly aristocratic, privileged family. So he could do a lot of things that many of his contemporaries couldn't. So for that, of course, that we need to keep in mind. But what we also need to keep in mind is that a lot of people actually don't make use of privileges as sincerely or as, shall I say, conscientiously as Tagore did. Again, not to defend the class position or the privilege that he had. So the connectedness, as it were, and this idea that we should all be living in harmony. And lastly, particularly in relation to my school, the fact that we should all, the hastiness that's there on our part, this is something that needs to be done away with. Because usually what happens is that we are not patient. We are very, very impatient for the most part. And this is why education suffers big time. Because education has a deep connection with patience. Because only through patient learning and patient observation, very, very meditative engagement with stuff all around, people can essentially, or children can essentially be nurtured the right way. And I'm particularly reminded of an example here. I'll just give this example, it'll take a minute or two. I was reading an interview that was given by a famous yoga couple, old, very, very old yoga couple, in their 90s. The gentleman in his 90s and the lady, the woman in her late 80s. And this was, I think, in the Hindu, in one of the weekly supplements. And so the interview, and I find this every time I've gone back to that, I've gone back to this interview, I've found new meanings out of the text. So the first question that the interviewer poses to this couple, a very extraordinary couple, is that what do you think we should do? Right? Because they are yoga, they teach yoga across the world and they have acquired a certain rhythm, very patient people, very, very sorted, calm. So the question is, what do you think we should do? Now the lady says, and listen to this. The lady says the first thing that we must do is we must breathe. This is what she says, and this is where the answer ends. We must breathe. Now, this is a fantastic answer. It's as striking as anything else. So the idea is that something that is so fundamental to human existence, breathing, we are not doing that properly. In fact, part of yoga essentially has to do with understanding how to breathe, right? Because breathing is so, and this is so bewildering in a certain sense that we are essentially compromising on something that accounts for that is so fundamental. So, and every time I go back to this, one thing that I do is I inhale as much as I can because for months you don't do this. For months your breathing is so hasty. You're just somehow managing the oxygen carbon dioxide transaction, which is why very often, the situation gets worse when we are immediately exposed to polluted landscapes, etc. So, hastiness. We are always in so much hurry, and if we are in hurry, then we will compromise vis-a-vis living, as Tagore says. Because fundamentally, if there's one thing that we should all adhere to, or fundamentally, if there is one thing to which our loyalty is supposed to be, it is living. So if you're not loyal to living, then no matter what we are doing, whether we are succeeding or not, we are essentially a failure. Right? We have just ruined ourselves and we have completely compromised on our existence. So for living, you need to completely dissociate yourself with this predominant culture of hastiness because there's so much pace all around, there's so much speed, and as a result of that, we compromise on a lot of things. Now, this is what my school, the education bit is. Now, let me just quickly I'll just take a minute. I need to connect the charger because the laptop is low on charge right now. Just a moment. Now, let's just quickly, I just take 5 to 10 minutes, not more than that. Let me now move on to religiosity. Right? How do we engage with this whole idea of religiosity? Of course, you have a poet's religion. I don't want to go into that because it's a very detailed piece and it talks about various aspects. But let me try and in the next 8 or 10 minutes, let me try and see if there is a connection between Tagore's idea of religiosity and what we have discussed so far. Spirit of freedom, how freedom is conceptualized, and the ways in which freedom and education go hand in gloves. You see, one thing that we must start with is that religiosity and religion are, of course, two different things. I don't have to. There could be connection between the two, but there's a reason why Tagore is more inclined towards using religiosity. Now, what is religiosity? Right? I am reminded of a fascinating remark that Tolstoy made. So it's a celebrated tract that Tolstoy wrote. What is art? Right? You might have seen it, you might have read it, and in that particular piece, there's a section where Tolstoy is talking about music, and in that section, Tolstoy is talking about the great German composer Beethoven, and Tolstoy says that every time I listen to Beethoven, there is something religious that happens to me. Right? This is the expression. And I think this is a very, very profound statement that Beethoven does something religious to me. Now, what does that mean? What is this religious thing that's happening? I'll give you another example. Let us assume, and of course, these examples, there's a caveat in the sense that only those of us who have that required sensibility can actually perhaps, shall I say, make sense of these examples. But I'm willing to take the risk here. So let's say you are in the mountains or wherever, and you're watching sunset, and it's an accidental, as it were, sight. But you are you're left speechless by the sheer beauty of that landscape. The sun is setting down, the mood of the day is changing, new colors are emerging, The existing colors are fading. There's so much music in the overall atmosphere in a certain sense. And for a moment, I mean, depends, for a moment, for a few minutes, for an hour, you are completely struck by the sheer majesty of nature and the sheer miracle that's all around. Now, if we were to borrow from Tagore, this is essentially a moment of religiosity. In what sense? Religiosity, according to Tagore, is an experience, whether it's a momentary experience or a longer than momentary experience, but it's an experience that essentially elevates our being. So we are raised above ourselves. So when you're watching a sunset, or you're looking at the majesty of a mountain, or you're looking at the silence of a sea, or you're looking at the tree or wilderness, greenery, or a squirrel nibbling, one thing that happens for that one moment is that you go beyond your corporeality, you go beyond your physical body. There is a moment that you are more than yourself. And this is the moment of religiosity. Right? This is, of course, there are mystics, there are saints who also talk about it as a spiritual moment, because spirituality is not something that can only happen when you go on a retreat, right? Spirituality is not something that will only happen when you attend Isha Foundation camp. Spirituality is not something that will happen when you are mentored by some spiritual guru. No, we can all have our own share of spirituality. Like you watch an old man walking down the road, that could be a spiritual experience. You watch a flower blooming, you watch a butterfly moving around, you watch a child playing or chasing a butterfly, that could itself be a very, very spiritual moment in a certain sense, because anything that relieves you of the physical confines momentarily or more than that, for a duration longer than that, is essentially a religiosity bit, right? A spiritual moment. Now, what happens when that happens? So, for instance, when this elevation happens, then one thing that happens is a certain kind of interconnectedness or relatedness takes place. So, for instance, when you're watching the sun go down, there's a way in which you're relating to the sun. So, the sun ceases to be a fact about, a fact that you've read about. So, for instance, the sun is not just another a star that is only to be understood in terms of fusion reaction, right? That there are hydrogen atoms, they sort of fuse, and then it leads to this. Hydrogen is constantly getting converted into helium, and etc., etc. So nuclear physics is not at all helpful when you are watching a sunset, right? Your botany lessons are not at all helpful when you are watching the grandeur of a tree. Your understanding of child psychology, etc., might not help much when you're just seeing a child aimlessly and in his own her own way, stalking a butterfly. So the facts are facts, but in these moments you realize that how limiting facts can be. The sun ceases to be this fact. So the sun is no more understood strictly in terms of the solar system or in terms of a star or in terms of hydrogen converting into helium, etc. What has happened is that there is a certain connectedness that has emerged between you and sun. There's a certain relatedness that has happened between you and the mountain, between you and the tree, between you and the butterfly, between you and the squirrel, etc., etc. So this is something that Tagore considers very, very paramount as far as the bit on religiosity is concerned. That religiosity is essentially something that is always taking us beyond our body. It is elevating us. It's a moment, for the lack of a better phrase, it's a moment of transcendence. We transcend ourselves. And the moment we transcend ourselves, then all kinds of mysterious, magical things begin to take place. Now, if you were to take this example, this reference of religiosity, and then bring it back into education, then how does one make sense of that? For instance, touching a tree is about going beyond the the mental, right? The very restricted, limited understanding. So when you're touching a tree, when you're walking barefoot, when you are completely absorbed in the grace of a full moon or a crescent or a tree, for a moment what is happening is that you are essentially getting into that unity, as Tagore points out, the divine unity, that we are all becoming part of that one whole, as it were. And Tagore again and again says that growth is not understood in terms of part acquiring greater, broader proportions. He says growth is to be understood in terms of one wholeness proceeding towards bigger wholeness, right? So we should constantly be, as I was pointing out earlier, not here, elsewhere. So we are always on the move. It's always in the making. So Tagore is, for instance, religion. Why is it that Tagore is not necessarily in favor of organized religion? Because religion has definite answers to everything. But religiosity, on the other hand, does not engage with answers. It's a deeper engagement with questions, as it were. It's a deeper engagement with curiosity. It's a deeper engagement with fearless inquiry. And you just keep going. And as you indulge or as you go deeper and deeper and deeper, the reality keeps unfolding itself. So not here, elsewhere. So you're always confronting. You're always, uh, as it were, face to face with newer forces, newer manifestations, newer visions of reality. So that is one thing. The other thing that is important is that this whole idea of, for instance, drawing connections. I'll give you an example again, and I think examples make sense more than straight away texts do. So, for instance, let's say you have a garden or you have a balcony where you have kept few plants, and let's say because we remain busy once in a while, let's say that you did not water few plants and they're kind of wilted, right? They're no more as fresh and as soft as they were at one point in time. Now, what do you do? So, usually, what people would do is they would just bring a mug of water or a glass of water and they would pour the water in the pot. That's one way of doing it. But if you actually look at a child, let's say a child is into gardening, right? A child is, so what does a child do? A child does not, and this is a child who's not taught, by the way. He has not attended any gardening workshop. He has not attended gardening lectures. This is something that the child has learned on his or her own. So what does a child do? The child would essentially pour water in the pot, but the child would also hold the leaves in his or her hand and would spray water, would touch the leaves with wet hands. So the child would also want to put some water on the leaves. And believe me, as you do this, this is something that I did not a while ago, but several weeks ago, that there was a plant that had almost died. And so my daughter told me that what you need to do is, as you spray the leaves of the plant, you need to hold the leaves in your hands. Right? You can't, I mean, of course, you spray the leaves, fair enough, that's great. But if you hold the leaves, if you place your hand beneath the leaves and then you spray water on the leaves, it does something miraculous. So the plant essentially comes back to life in a day as opposed to in a week or 3 days. Now, what is happening as you touch the leaf, as you place your hand beneath the leaves? There is a certain kind of interconnectedness. This is a moment of religiosity, as Tagore points out. This is the relatedness. Now, education deprives us of this relatedness, right? Education would not let us touch, right? Education would always want us to remain a little distant. So even if dust is brought, it will be brought in a jar, and the jar will be circulated in the entire class. So I will look at the jar, I'll pass on to the person sitting next to me, and this kid will look at the jar. Flowers will also be brought as specimen, right? So I will see, we will be taken to lab, and we will be shown that this is a rose, this is this. It's all museumized, right? Pathologically so. But imagine if a child is essentially taken to a garden, a park, and the child is, just let free. The child is just on his or her own. Then the child gets educated in a very, very different way. So the idea that there is something very fundamental about connectedness. If you're not able to draw connections, if you're not able to relate with other versions of it, manifestations of existence, then your education is not going to take you very far. You might get a degree, you might become a doctor, you might become whoever you want to. You will be teaching, you will be learning, you will carry an I card, you will get salary from the university, but the spirit of education will be missing because the religiosity bit is compromised. right? The relatedness, the interconnectedness that exists in all existence, as Tagore points out. That is something that is so pathologically missing. Now, to end, so fundamentally, this is what we are essentially then left with is that there is a way in which fearlessness, inner journey, acceptance, and interconnectedness inform each other. So at the root of it is this idea that all life is one, right? And what the modern education has done is it has severed one form of life from another, right? So it has bombarded us with facts, and in a hasty world where we are so it's all so so fast. Everything is happening within minutes, within seconds, within hours, and therefore we are not able to just take a pause, reflect, engage, introspect, etc., etc. This is something that's not happening. So what essentially Tagore, and I'm reminded of an example. In fact, there was a time a professor of ours took us to the mountains, and we were walking down a path, and there's a place called Sunset Point. So we were just standing there, and the sun was setting down, and suddenly, a bunch of guys came. So they came, they drove. So it was a car. So they stopped, and we were just sitting. Some of us research scholars or professors, we were just sitting and generally, talking and enjoying the scene. Some of us meditating not in a formal technical sense, but meditating in the sense that silently uh, absorbing. So these guys came, and they had huge cameras, as it were, and uh, what essentially the driver, as in, of course, one of the friends, he said, guys, we have 5 minutes here. Take as many photographs as you can, and then from here we need to go and grab a cup of coffee. Now, this is precisely the pathological side of the world in which we live, right? Because what happens is that you are not able to let it let it sink in, as it were. So even when you're watching a sunset, it's a very clocked watching. So you've got 5 minutes, get off, stretch, see the sunset, take few photographs, and then leave. And don't talk about it ever again. Whereas the idea is, I'm not saying that people should just sit there for the rest of their lives, but even if you sit there for a minute, you should sit there with a certain mindfulness, right? This is also something that Tagore insists on various other writings, that mindfulness, that informed that informed sense of presence. This is my moment, and this is a moment wherein something exceedingly sacred is happening. I'll just use a verse and then I'll end. Tagore, in one of his verses, and I read this verse when I was reviewing a book, Essential Tagore, that came out in 2009. It was published by Harvard University Press. It's a fascinating collection of various songs and plays and short stories and essays by Tagore. So there's a verse by Tagore that says that I know, my prayers for life that haven't been answered have not been lost. Right? This is the couplet. I know, my prayers for life that have not been answered have not been lost. What is he pointing out? Again, if you are understanding yourself as an individual who is completely disconnected from the rest of the world, then of course your prayers for life will be lost. If things haven't happened, then you realize that the prayers haven't really fetched the desire. But if you can see the interconnections, if you see the deep connections that exist between various manifestations of existence, then even if the prayers are not answered, they are not lost. Right? The connection, that is the religiosity. And for instance, there's another verse where it says that I touch God through my songs the way a distant mountain touches the sea through the waterfall. That's a beautiful imagery. So when you think about the mountain, you think about the sea, these are two different worlds altogether. I mean, for instance, in India, coming from the north, so Uttaranchal, you never ever think about the sea, and when you are next to the sea, you don't even think about the mountains. But Tagore is drawing such a beautiful connection that the mountain and the sea are always connected to each other. All you need to do is just remember that there is a stream of water that connects these two otherwise distantly located manifestations, majestic manifestations of nature. Of course, there's more that could be said, but I'll just stop here. Thank you very much for your exceptionally patient listening. Thank you.
Thanks very much, sir, for this enlightening talk. We have got some questions in the chat box. The first one is by Manjeet Kashyap. He asks, Sir, Gurudev Rabindranath Tagore Kabuliwala is a highly researched short story and Biopopala is a good adaptation. Raham, the titular, a dry food seller from Kabul to Kolkata, engages himself very gently with little meaning. He may continue for many days, but the mystery of his punishment to jail for many years is not clearly drafted. Why?
Okay, see, I don't. I'm actually reminded of a very interesting phrase. Pardon the indulgence here, but Iqbal at one point of time said, "Don't dissect, dissection kills." Very often, I think people who are massively invested in, majorly invested in literary criticism should keep this line in mind. Of course, there are various things that could be pointed out when it comes to Kabuliwala, and any and shall I say, we're not unfamiliar with that training. People have pointed out various issues, and there could be issues with reference to the ways in which the characters acquire a certain shape, the characters build up, etc. But my position is, and I genuinely say this, I'm not saying this because Tagore happens to be the writer. I think I would want to say that there are few strengths that a great writer is best without. Right. So let a story also have shall I say, a certain humaneness to it. Let there be missing ends here and there. But as far as the question, this was just to pitch what I genuinely believe in, and I'm reading a story, and if a story really touches me, I don't necessarily go into why exactly this didn't happen, because I don't reach that stage, unfortunately or fortunately. The mystery, I don't know, maybe Tagore, I think Tagore is particularly, it's been a while since I read Kabuliwala, but I think Tagore is particularly interested in a certain sense, I think, recollection, memory, again, the idea of the home and the world, because that is one theme that is always to be found in various literary outputs of Tagore, that even if you have a place where you stay, the home is always a past reference, right? Our Shairi pointed this out very beautifully. Home is always a past reference. So in that sense, I think there's a way in which the Afghan is depicted. There's a way in which his character is sketched. There are, of course, the mystery. There's a very passing reference that this happened and there was some enmity, and there's also a slight cliche that Tagore is essentially falling for. I think for that he can also be held accountable. That the Afghan essentially loses temper in no time. But the Afghan is also someone who's driven. So on both ends of the spectrum, the Afghan is an Afghan. So the Afghan is also crying incessantly, and the Afghan is also someone who becomes angry before the drop of a hat. So I think this is what I can think of, that it was just a passing reference, because I think what happens subsequently is something that perhaps as an author Tagore thinks is more important. But why exactly it doesn't happen, I really don't have an answer to that. All I can say is that when you like a story, or rather when you love a story, you sort of, pardon my vocabulary here, but you become indifferent to some of these things. But maybe one can think about it. This is not to dismiss the importance of the question, but I haven't really thought about it, and for a while I wouldn't want to. But just in case something comes up, I'll be more than happy to share.
Thank you, sir. Next we have Professor Priyanka Chakraborty. She asks, the whole idea of a holistic development of students, where he wants students to develop without a sense of confinement, physical and mental, was also highly associated with the sense of public health. There as well, he is seen applying the similar idea of development from inside, making the society self-restrained, as depicted in writings such as Ebar Firao More, Olautar Bistar, Itse, So, if you kindly tell us something about Tagore's idea of the role of students in public health.
Well, honestly speaking, I haven't read anything specifically in relation to Tagore's idea, Tagore's take on role of students in public health. And in any case, as you would know, I haven't read Tagore in original. Much of what I have read, in fact, all of what I have read, is in English. So I'm also, in that sense, I categorically put on record the fact that my understanding remains very, very elementary and formative in that sense. But I don't think, as I said, that I haven't read anything directly associated with the role of students in public health. But if you read in general the ways in which Tagore is conceptualizing education, one thing that, whether it's my school or in general, when he's talking about curiosity, sense of wonder, oceanic circles, etc., one thing that comes out very clearly, personality, very, very important reflection again. One thing that comes out very clearly is that once the education is not about, once we look into this issue, once we attend to this fundamental problem that education is to do with mental and not necessarily physical and spiritual, then what begins to happen? So once that bit is taken care of, then what essentially happens is that the student or the individual is essentially able to acquire a certain personality, right? The individuality remains in place, right? Now, once that happens, so once you have this interconnectedness, once you have an individual who is educated in a way that he or she is able to all the time, invariably, look above or above himself or herself, or raise, is able to raise himself or herself above his immediate body corporeality, then I think the question of surrounding immediately, it gets attended to in a slightly different way. So in that sense, that freedom with which the student is entering into the world, the curiosity, the sympathy with which the acceptance, the degree of acceptance with which the person, the individual is entering the world, in a certain sense, does have a bearing on the overall medium, on the overall landscape within which he or she is situated. Now, what categorically would it lead to in terms of public health is something that I haven't really read how does Tagore look at the question of public health. But my hunch is, and I don't think this is news, I think all of us can very much figure it out on our own, that my hunch is that any individual who is raised on the dosage of the kind of education that Tagore envisions or pitches a case for, will always be one who has a very, very informed understanding of not just public, but also health. So in that sense, it will also add the commonsensical understanding of public health. So we will have a very, very informed, elevated, nuanced understanding of both what constitutes the public, how is the public to be looked at, and what exactly is health, when exactly is a person healthy, etc. This is what my hunch is. I might be right, I might not be right, but as I said, that I haven't categorically read anything directly related to the role of students in public health.
Thank you, sir. Next we have Harita Tripathi. He asks, can meta-ethics concept be the salvation in Tagore's view?
One can, of course, Tagore is essentially someone who is very much, he's an ardent admirer of universals, and in fact, his poetry is one that brings us, that pushes us towards poetic universalism again and again. So he is someone who is in favor of grand, not necessarily grand, but let's say broad landscaping or broad frames of unity, broad frames of oneness, etc. The concept of salvation, as far as my understanding is concerned, again, I think someone else can perhaps add to this. But I think Tagore, in a certain sense, is not adhering to the theological understanding of salvation. Although his understanding vis-a-vis religiosity, vis-a-vis the spiritual side of man, is very much informed by, as I said in the beginning, the Upanishadic thought, the Upanishadic philosophy. But what I think in Tagore, I think the salvation is more to do with ever evolving realization of meanings that are implicit in living. So it is not necessarily something that happens post death or something that happens towards the end of life or something that happens as a result of A, B, and C. But Tagore is someone who is always an advocate of, an ardent advocate of what we call process. So he's talking about the length of the accomplishment, the length of the journey, more than, as I said, not here, elsewhere. This very suggestively informs us where exactly is he situated. So salvation, of course, is a very important concern. But I think more than a theologically informed or a conventional understanding of salvation, which has to do with a certain code of conduct, a certain adherence to essentials within the religious framework, Tagore is more interested in meaningful living. And to him, what is meaningful is something that is always in the making. So, what is salvation is to me, and this is again an understanding in the making. Salvation in Tagore's conception is something that is always acquiring newer meanings, and which is why, as I was saying earlier as well, that living patiently or living with that meditative observation, as it were, or meditative focus, is something that becomes very fundamental. So it is to do with living mindfully, living in the present, and with that sense of relatedness and connectedness that one is able to go beyond. And in fact, if salvation, even if we were to think about salvation in terms of a certain kind of release or a certain kind of liberation, then once again to go back to Tagore's understanding of religiosity, as I was pointing out, that Tagore would want us to be liberated from the confines of the mental, from the spell of the facts. So in that sense, one is, in a certain sense, experiencing salvation. As far as my reading is concerned, he hasn't spelled this out. This is just loud thinking on my part. So he might have spelled out something completely different in some of his writings that I haven't consulted yet. But my hunch is, on the basis of whatsoever little I have discerned from Tagore, I think what is important is that he is essentially interested in the idea of liberation, but this idea of liberation is something that's to do with mindful attention to or mindful focus on the deep connections that exist. So as we are able to go beyond ourselves, as we are able to see the deep connections that exist between various manifestations of existence, there's a way in which salvation takes place. There's a way in which we are able to liberate ourselves from the confines of the corporeal, from the dictates, or let's say from the limitations of the physical. This is what I can say at this moment.
Thank you, sir. Next we have Kasturi Das. She would like to draw an observation, which is she would like you to throw some light on.
Even after all such different discourses by Tagore, there is a huge tendency of straitjacketing Tagore as a primary romantic. But at times, his words have resonances of what we now categorize as post-structural or postmodernist. For example, this essay called The Fool constantly echoes what Foucault would later call docile bodies. Tagore exactly points out how individuals are situated as subjects in various forces from the moment of birth.
Yes, Kasturi, I think it's a very important remark that you've made. You're absolutely right. I mean, when you read, in fact, not just that, a lot of stuff on post-colonialism is traced back to, a lot of people essentially look at nationalism in India, nationalism in the West, and nationalism in Japan as essentially prefaces to what we call post-colonial studies. The ways in which Tagore is looking at the question of colony, the question of nationalism, the question of nation states, etc. But to come back to what you're pointing out, absolutely, there's no denying, as I said in the beginning, that there is a certain sensibility that we need, and I'm not being, I'm sorry if I come across as rude or as an arrogant person here, but I genuinely believe that there are things that don't strike us if we don't have in us what it takes to be struck by something. So, for instance, there is a possibility that a full moon doesn't strike us. There's a possibility that a tree doesn't strike us. There's a possibility that a butterfly doesn't appeal to us. You cannot now, through a workshop, through a webinar, through a discussion, I cannot do this. You cannot do this to me. If I don't attend to the wonders that are all around, then there's not much. I mean, of course, miracles do take place all the time, but there's not much that can happen. I'm reminded of a great line by a critic who said, and he said it so well, he said that either you understand a verse or you do not understand a verse. There's nothing in between. So if a poem is, if you're reading a poem, either you understand it or you do not understand it. Now, if you do not understand it, of course one can explain the poem, but a poem is more than the syntax. A poem is more than words. There's something, just like a tree is more than photosynthesis. So I cannot, anyone cannot necessarily, convey the spirit of a text. So Tagore is very often considered a romantic. One could call him a romantic, but there are writings of his that would contest that position. He is a modernist in several writings of his. There is something exceptionally realistic about some of his reflections on, say, for instance, the question of agency, the question of nationalism, womanhood, politics, village, caste, etc. So he is a romantic because at the end of the day, as I said, he is a poet. And there's just no way in which he can do away with that. So there is, and I don't think earlier people used to talk about it. I think people, for instance, the generation in Shantiniketan that Tagore was nurturing in the 1930s, I don't think those guys were considering Tagore as a romantic. I think for them Tagore was an extraordinary mentor. And many other scholars, for instance, people like Krishna Kumar, who happens to be a great educationist, people like Krishnamurti, the world teacher, and these guys never ever considered Tagore a romantic. Yes, people from the political mainstream, for instance, when Gandhi would be pissed off with, disappointed with, and would get irritated by Tagore's insistence on something, Gandhi once in a while would say that, the poet does not understand the reality of everyday existence. Gandhi would indulge in that kind of commentary because although I don't think Gandhi would do it instantly, but after like series of conversations when Gandhi would just lose it completely, he would say, guess what, you are a poet, you will never understand what people go through. Nehru has also said this. But the fact of the matter is that, even if he is a romantic, I think what's wrong in being a romantic? As a great teacher, a contemporary teacher from JNU points out that what else is studentship but a genuine ardent pursuit of a certain kind of romanticism, right? Learning is all about romance with ideas. Learning is all about romance with various positions. So that is one, but you're absolutely right. Primarily romantic, and therefore, people kind of don't attend to his words as often as they should. You're absolutely right. Some of the things that Tagore has written about, but I would always want to treat Tagore and Foucault as, because Foucault's intervention is, in terms of the epistemic positioning, Foucault's intervention is more driven by the world of facts, right? So, when Foucault is essentially talking about clinic, or he's talking about asylum, or he's talking about schools or prisons, there's a way in which Foucault, trained in the modern episteme, would historicize, would draw our attention to how madness at one point of time was conceptualized, and then how at one point of time madness began to be seen. People started seeing madness as this. How prison or how punishment. If you go back to the early, the first two paragraphs of Discipline and Punish, how punishment was a spectacle, what used to happen, what was the possibility when people were punished, open, etc., etc., and how from there it comes to solitary confinement. So it was something very academic, epistemically speaking, or epistemologically speaking, it's a very powerful, grounded critique of modern ways in which things have been defined and disseminated. Tagore, on the other hand, is essentially borrowing from life, and majorly from life. So the examples that Tagore give actually remain with, they remain with me. I don't know if they remain with you, but they must, they ought to. there are, of course, connections. Docile bodies, yes, Foucault has given a very charming word. Tagore does not really come across as that charming. I mean, you talk about, I'll just say this again, you talk about Tagore and people don't necessarily get impressed in a seminar. But the moment you borrow from Foucault, suddenly there is a stunned silence. Right? So Foucault also comes with that power knowledge connection, the Foucauldian discourse. So of course, docile bodies is catchy, right? And when Tagore says that we have not come to, when he says that there is a difference between originality and truthfulness, it's not very catchy. It is something for which you might have to bang your head and really think a lot and acquire a certain sensibility to be able to figure out what the hell this poet philosopher is up to. So docile body is very catchy. This is not to dismiss or demean Foucauldian intervention. I think it's one of the most instrumental, path-breaking interventions in the past few decades. But we have to also understand there's a way in which something gets commodified and consumed, and there's a way in which something else gets tagged or labeled as exotic or romantic or not so real, etc. etc. But I'm glad you pointed this out.
Thank you, sir. Next we have Mayan Bharadwaj. He asks, isn't religiosity precisely spirituality per se? If yes, then is there any air of ambiguity at Tagore's part, or there is some unprecedented domain leading to a counter perspective?
It's not very easy to answer this question. I'm just, and I don't claim that I'll be able to answer this question. I'll just give it a shot. See, the religiosity as Tagore is perceiving, or when Tagore is writing on religion, if you read lectures that are in this collection, Religion of Man, or if there's a fantastic essay that you might want to read at some point, Religion of the Forest, where he so beautifully talks about interconnectedness, etc. He says that when Sita is taken by, when Ravan has taken Sita away, it is not just Ram and Lakshman who are completely broken and sad, but the entire forest is sad because Sita, Ram, and Lakshman have such deep connection with the forest that the entire forest has become gloomy and sad, and there's an atmosphere of despair all around. The trees are sad, and the bushes, the grass, etc. So there are various essays of Tagore where you get this feeling that what he is essentially meaning by religiosity, this is something that I believe in, and I stand corrected. Maybe a Tagore expert can always add what I have to say or altogether refute my claim. But what I genuinely believe in is that religiosity in Tagore is essentially about going beyond. It's a moment of transcendence in that sense. Spirituality, as we know, is a moment of transcendence. Or let's say it's an elevated understanding of the corporeal, right? So if we have to, I mean, we can perhaps entertain this position that religiosity per se is spirituality, given the connotations that we get, what the meanings that we discern as we read Tagore and religiosity. I would say that. I mean, there is, I don't know if there is an air of ambiguity at Tagore's part, but I think there's a way in which he is not only trying, I mean, I think there's a way in which he's trying to unsettle a certain discourse. Because let us also be very clear that when Tagore is writing, particularly late 19th, early 20th century, there are ways in which religion and education are also related to each other. There are deep connections. And of course, it has had severe effect on education. And we know caste education connections. We know how the lower caste, the marginalized sections of our society were completely, were mercilessly, brutally deprived of education because they belong to a certain section. So Tagore is also, by invoking this idea of religiosity, Tagore is also, to my mind, is trying to unsettle that granted connection. Right? So religion education connection is getting unsettled, is getting questioned by invoking religiosity and not religion. So that is one. So I think he is in a certain, and of course he belongs to that tradition of reforms within the realm of religion. He comes from the Brahma Samaj tradition, wherein there's a way in which religion is looked at, or religiosity of the individual is looked at So I don't know if there is an air of ambiguity. I think Tagore is, as he is attending to questions related to education, freedom, morality, he is compelled to look into the question of religion, because there's just no way in which you could, if you are writing in the late 19th, early 20th century, or if you're writing throughout the 19th century and the early 20th century, there's no way in which you could bypass the question of religion. You have to, because religion is informing the domain of politics, religion is informing the domain of culture, religion is informing the domain of education. A lot of critique of modern education was also coming from religious seminaries, right? So Tagore does not want education to go to the other end either. So it is not about a very typical nativist, or not necessarily nativist, but let's say theology, religion informed position that critiques the modern education. So Tagore, I don't think there is an air of ambiguity. I think there's a playfulness on the part of Tagore. This is something that you will find in most of his prose works, barring stuff that categorically looks at political themes. For instance, nationalism will not have any of what we find in Poet's Religion or Religion of the Forest or My School. But for the most part, there's a certain playfulness, there's a certain poetics to the ways in which the prose unfolds itself. As students, we can look at it from the vantage point of what you said. But as far as my understanding is concerned, I don't think that is what the case is.
Thank you, sir. Next we have Prachi Chauhan. She asks, Sir, Tagore has mentioned about debunking the national boundaries and the borders and ascending internationalism. So, under postcolonial discourse, can we understand this the concept of cultural hybridity in Tagore himself?
Of course, cultural hybridity is a more recent term, and it has a certain currency, of course. But Tagore, of course, for a very long time was talking about a certain kind of cosmopolitanism. And Tagore is also someone who talked about world literature. So, in fact, although not really a historian that very often people consider as first rate, but Ramchandra Guha, the man is also found in various controversies off and on. But Ramchandra Guha, if you go through this work, Makers of Modern India, if I remember correctly, Makers of Modern India. So the excerpts of what he has done is he's actually brought various excerpts into one volume, and it's a great collection behind that. So he's called Tagore, I think that's a very apt framing. He calls Tagore the rooted cosmopolitan. Right, so a man who has actually traveled all the way to Latin America, traveled all the way to the Far East, he's gone to Japan, he's traveled pretty much half of the world. At a time when traveling was a rare thing, of course, traveling abroad, crossing the seas, etc. But what happens is that his cosmopolitanism is of a slightly different kind. His cosmopolitanism, or his hybrid individuality, as it were, is of a slightly different kind. His cosmopolitanism is premised on a very informed understanding of the local tradition and the roots of culture and civilization. His cosmopolitanism is not one that is, in a certain sense, borrowing from a certain kind of cultural relativism. I don't think that is the case. I'm particularly reminded of a fascinating essay by Nehru. And I think Tagore kind of can be understood from that. Nehru, when he inaugurated this organization, this body called Indian Council for Cultural Relations, ICCR, it's in Delhi. I think it was inaugurated in 1953 or 55. I don't exactly remember the year. So Nehru delivered a talk. This talk was called What is Culture? Nehru said two things. Of course, he said a lot of things, and it's a fascinating essay. You might want to read it at some point. But there are two things that are very important about Nehru's understanding of culture. And I think Tagore's understanding of cosmopolitanism can be understood from that vantage point. Nehru says that culture must have two things, a great culture. He says it must have depth, right? It must have deep roots so that it doesn't disappear as a result of changes that are happening off and on. Right? So it must have solid, deep roots, right? It must be rooted. It must have a certain depth. But at the same time, culture should also be dynamic. It should be open to new developments. And Nehru says that only a great culture can demonstrate the right balance. If there is no depth, problem. If there is only dynamism, problem. So you remain rooted. But at the same time, there is also a way in which you are evolving. I think Tagore, in a certain sense, was endorsing. In fact, Tagore said this way before Nehru, and I won't be surprised if Nehru, because he was massively majorly impressed by Tagore's writings. I won't be surprised if Nehru is also borrowing here and there from Tagore. The idea that there is a cosmopolitanism, that you need to go beyond the national boundaries, that you need to understand that the political is not the eventual, that the political is not the final. But at the same time, there is something that is important, that is sacrosanct about your locatedness, not in national terms, but in very, very everyday, immediate, natural terms. So your imagination, for instance, Tagore was raised in a particular locality, as a result of which you will find references to the countryside, you will find references to river, to village, to fields, to crops, etc. If Tagore was raised in Gurgaon, I don't think Tagore would have written any of what he wrote because he was raised in a certain. So Tagore is not at all denying the importance of the immediate locale, but he is at the same time very clear that political is not the eventual destiny of human race. So he is making a case for cosmopolitanism, but at the same time, what he is also very, very categorical about is that roots are important. So there is a degree of natalism in that sense, there is this response to the erstwhile discourses since then. But he is very much someone who believes in Indian civilization and does not want, as Ashish Nandi points out beautifully in his reflection on in this article, Illegitimacy of Nationalism. He says that Tagore and Gandhi are the ones who do not want India as a civilization to lose out to or to be defeated by India as a nation. Right? So they would want India as a civilization to win over India as a nation. So Tagore is one. So he makes a case for a very rooted kind of cosmopolitanism. That's nice.
Thank you, Irfan.
Thank you, Vivek.
I was just about to say two things.
Yes.
Like, I don't need to just speak about lecture. People like who have been already spoken on this forum, people have already listened to you. There's interesting things that I wanted to share with you. One of my friend's daughter, Agrima Misra, she is in school days. She is not even in college days, she is in school days. I cannot exactly recall, it is I think 10th standard, no, not in 10th, I think in 7th or 8th standard. I sent her the list that you had shared with me, and to my surprise, she read all the pieces. And you see that she attended the entire lecture. She is here from 2:25 and she is still here. Right? So, and second thing, most of our students have exam on 10th. Our graduate students, so exam is already scheduled. They are like BA final year English students. They already have exam on 10th. It's open book exam system. But I'm very happy that they also read the text and they are still here for 2 hours, right?
It's very humbling.
Yeah, I'm just very happy to see that our PG students as well, whose exam has to go on, likely to on 10th, they are also here and they are listening patiently to you past 2 hours. So, I'm happy that obviously to you that the way you speak is like I was listening to stories, right? Not able to think that. Was like, okay, someone is telling me a story, what has this happened and that happened. So the way you speak so coolly, right? जैसे कि like like घर की बातें बता रहे हो आप.
Tagore, you have to be cool about it. Offers that will be very, yeah, thank you for that.
So, and I'm sure that most of the students they came because it's Irfan who is speaking, right? So, I need your cooperation always, and the kind of humble attitude that you have, we don't feel shy towards it. Like, I have full confidence that I am going to call Irfan and Irfan is going to come to our session. Right? Without losing anything.
No, and please inform. I would also want to be the audience. I mean, I was at one point of time, but then something happened, and then I was kind of away from the platform. But keep dropping emails. I would love to be an audience for the people as well, not just coming and speaking.
One more lecture in this session, like I mean, month of September, because they have exams, so I will go ahead.
Yeah.
So, I mean, okay, I will give my formal vote of thanks to the last lecture, but if one is my friend, so I will always say to him, definitely you can come over here and say formal vote of thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. A very good afternoon to one and all present here. I, on behalf of Intersections, extend profound gratitude to all those who have assisted in achieving such pronounced outcome of this lecture. Firstly, I must mention our deep sense of appreciation and sincere thanks to our chief speaker, Dr. Irfanullah Farooqi. Thank you, sir, for your reinvigorating and intriguing talk on the topic Freedom, Religiosity, and Education, exploring Tagore's philosophy, where you talked about how Tagore understands freedom, that says freedom is not necessarily something that could be transferred, but it needs to be realized deep within. And the concept of how a child is deprived from the wholeness of the world and about what education actually means to the God. You also talked about religiosity, as in which is an experience that elevates our being, along with many such insightful points. Thank you, sir. I would like to take this opportunity to place on record our hearty thanks to Dr. Vivek Singh. Sir, it's solely because of your motivation, support, and guidance extended to all of us that we are able to hear such preeminent and prestigious intellectuals. I also extend my thanks to all the participants for their gracious presence and enormous cooperation. I also take this opportunity to thank all the teachers who have reached out to us, imparting knowledge in various fields in all possible ways. Thank you.
Thank you, Vivek. Thank you very much. Okay, thank you, everyone. I think I can just, now we can. Yes, take care, Vivek. Take care, all of you. Stay safe. Thank you very much. Okay.